There are currently 0 Waltons stores that remain open in Australia. And embarrassingly, the site of its former flagship store, once the busiest corner in Sydney, has been completely erased, replaced by a generic, soulless office tower that gives no clue to what stood there before. No doubt, this is a humiliating legacy for a company that, as recently as the 1970s, reigned supreme as the king of Australian department stores. In fact, just a few decades ago, Waltons operated 96 stores across the continent. And for millions of Australian families, shopping at Waltons wasn't just a monthly event. It was a way of life. It was the place where you bought your first school uniform, your first record player, and perhaps even your first home furniture set, all on the promise of a signature at the bottom of a dotted line. Join me as we take a trip back in time, before the corporate raiders, before the scandals, and before the wrecking balls arrived, back to the days of rooftop cafes, store currency, and the distinctive smell of a new department store. Attention Australian shoppers. For the next few minutes, there is a special offer in the History Lounge as we revisit the golden age of Waltons. The name Waltons starts with a man named John Walton. He was a man who, were he not the owner, would likely have been its best customer. He was ambitious, he was aggressive, and he had a vision that went beyond just selling socks and toasters. In 1951, he looked at the Australian retail landscape and saw it was too slow, too polite. He didn't want to wait for customers to come to him. He went to them. At the time, Australian retail was dominated by the old guard, families like the Hordens and the Lloyd Joneses, who ran their empires like aristocratic estates. They expected customers to be grateful for the privilege of shopping. John Walton didn't care about privilege. He cared about volume. He started small, but his appetite was huge. He swallowed up historic competitors like Anthony Hordens and Marcus Clark, devouring their customers and their prime real estate. The acquisition of Anthony Hordens was particularly shocking. This was a store that had been known as the Universal Provider, a place so vast it had its own postcode. When Walton took it over, it signalled a changing of the guard. The old dusty way of doing business was dead. The era of the aggressive retailer had arrived. By the 1960s, Waltons had grown into a behemoth. It was the second largest retailer in the country, fighting tooth and nail for dominance. But the retail world was evolving and Walton was determined to evolve with it. On George Street in Sydney, he built a palace, a flagship store that wasn't just a shop, it was a destination. It was a monolith of commerce that dominated the skyline near the town hall. Inside, it was a world of its own. The elevators were manned by uniformed attendants. The air conditioning, a rarity in the muggy Sydney summers, was always set to a crisp, inviting chill. By the 1970s, Waltons was untouchable. Just like Kmart in America, Waltons had something for everyone. Shoppers could find everything they needed under one roof. From high fashion that mimicked the boutiques of London with racks of paisley shirts and bell-bottom trousers that defined the era, to the sturdy, reliable kitchen appliances that filled every suburban home. The fashion department deserves a special mention. In the 1970s, Waltons wasn't just selling clothes. They were selling a dream of sophistication. You could buy a safari suit that made your dad look like a tropical explorer, or a polyester evening gown that promised to turn a suburban dinner party into a gala event. It was affordable glamour, accessible to anyone with a pay packet. The mannequins in the windows were always dressed in the latest styles from Carnaby Street, or at least a very convincing Australian imitation of them. The store was a hit, and by the mid-1970s, Waltons was opening stores in suburbs all over the country. They were ubiquitous. You could drive from Parramatta to Penrith, or from Chadstone to Frankston, and you would see that familiar signage. But the Waltons experience wasn't confined to the store. It came to your front door. This is a part of the story we often forget. The Waltons man. Back in the 60s and 70s, Waltons employed an army of door-to-door salesmen. These weren't the aggressive telemarketers of today. They were smooth operators in cheap suits, driving Holden station wagons filled with catalogues. They would knock on the door of a fibro house in the western suburbs, hat in hand, and ask if the lady of the house had a moment. They would sit in your lounge room, drink your tea, and compliment your curtains. And then they would open the catalogue. "Mrs. Smith," they'd say, "you look like a woman who appreciates quality." And frankly, this old sofa doesn't do you justice. It was a seductive pitch. They weren't selling furniture, they were selling dignity. They were offering working-class families a chance to have the same nice things as the rich people on the North Shore. And the best part? You didn't need the money, you just needed to sign. Back in those days, the availability of such credit was a new thing for most shoppers. In decades past, you had to save up cash. But Waltons introduced the Waltons Bond, a store currency that lets you buy now, pay later. This was revolutionary. The Waltons Bond wasn't just a credit card, it was a passport to the middle class. Before this, if you wanted a new washing machine, you saved for months. With the Waltons Bond, you walked in, signed a piece of paper, and the washing machine was on the truck to your house that afternoon. It changed the psychology of the Australian shopper. It shifted the culture from one of thrift to one of immediate gratification. With the introduction of the Waltons card, suburban shoppers could furnish their entire homes today and worry about the bill tomorrow. And millions did. It became a status symbol to have that card in your wallet. It meant you were trusted. It meant you were part of the modern economy. As a kid in the 70s, you knew what you were in for when your mum took you to Waltons. It wasn't just shopping. It was an outing. While your mum perused the racks of polyester dresses or the latest copper-bottomed saucepans, you'd be treated to a milkshake in the rooftop cafe. Do you remember the specific magic of those rooftop cafeterias? They felt enormous, like airport terminals for cake. The trays were heavy plastic, usually orange or brown. The noise was a constant clatter of cutlery and chatter. You could look out the window and see the city spread out below you, feeling like you were on top of the world, eating a frog in a pond or a vanilla slice that was mostly custard and nostalgia. For kids, there was often a small playground or at least a toy department that felt like Aladdin's cave. You could wander through aisles of Tonka trucks and Barbie dolls, dreaming of what you'd put on your Christmas list, while the ding-dong of the store announcements played overhead, calling for a price check in haberdashery. And the more time you spent in the store, the more you felt part of something bigger. It felt safe. It felt permanent. You saw the same staff members year after year. They knew your name. They knew your mother's name. It was a community hub disguised as a corporation. Nobody knew it at the time, but the 1980s would be the end of Walton's reign as the nation's department store king. In 1981, things started to get ugly. Literally, a shark entered the water. Alan Bond, the high-flying billionaire who saw Waltons not as a store, but as a real estate opportunity. Bond was a different creature entirely to John Walton. He wasn't a retailer. He was a deal-maker. He was famous for winning the America's Cup, for being the hero of the nation with his winged keel yacht. But in the boardroom, he was a predator. He looked at Waltons and he didn't see the staff, or the history, or the loyal customers. He saw the land value. He looked at that flagship store on George Street and saw a skyscraper. He wanted to knock it down. He had grand visions of building the Bond Centre, a monument to his own ego that would scrape the cloud. The store itself was just an obstacle to be removed, a pile of bricks standing in the way of progress. This was the moment the soul of the company died. Under Bond's ownership, all the familiar details that made Waltons Waltons began to disappear. The quality dropped. The family feel evaporated. The focus shifted from service to squeezing every cent out of the credit customers. The anti-Waltons campaign began. It turned out those buy now, pay later contracts were a trap. With interest rates that would make a loan shark blush, consumer groups began to investigate the fine print of the Waltons bond. What they found was shocking. Interest rates that compounded in ways average people couldn't understand. Terms that locked people into debt for years longer than the lifespan of the cheap furniture they had bought. Stories began to emerge of pensioners being harassed by debt collectors for trivial amounts, of families losing their household goods because they missed a single payment. The friendly face of the Waltons man, who used to knock on doors to offer credit, was replaced by the menacing face of the repo man. These weren't just financial transactions, they were betrayals. The trust that John Walton had built over 30 years was dismantled in less than 5. The brand went from being a trusted family friend to a symbol of corporate greed and predatory lending. The demolition of the George Street store was the final insult. It happened quickly. The fixtures were sold off, the staff were let go, and the wrecking balls swung. For people who had grown up visiting that store, seeing it reduced to rubble was heartbreaking. It wasn't just a building coming down, it was a piece of Sydney's soul being torn out. And for what? The Bond Centre stalled. Alan Bond's empire, built on debt and hubris, collapsed spectacularly. He went to prison. The site sat as a hole in the ground for years, a gaping wound in the middle of the city that reminded everyone of the disaster. In 1987, in an act of final desperation, the name was wiped off the map. The stores were sold and rebranded as Venture or Norman Ross. But it was too little, too late. The updated stores just didn't have the personality or charm of the old stores. They were just kind of bland and uninteresting. Venture tried to be a discount store without the prices of Kmart. Norman Ross tried to be an electrical retailer without the service. They were hollow shells of the Waltons empire, and eventually they too disappeared. The Venture chain collapsed in the 90s, another victim of the changing retail landscape and the cursed legacy it had inherited. Today, if you walk past the old sites, there is nothing left. The flagship store was demolished. The Bond Centre was never built. It's just a generic office tower. The Galleries Victoria Shopping Centre sits there now, filled with international brands and high-end fashion. But it lacks the warmth, the chaos, and the Australian character of the old Waltons. For most of us, Waltons is already just a memory. But as for me, when I look back at Waltons, I'm not going to be remembering the bankruptcy or the scandal. My mind will be strolling across those polished floors, smelling the perfume counter and hearing the clatter of the teacups in the cafe. Cue the nostalgic musical montage. If you remember the Waltons Bond or family trips to the city, hit that like button. And if you enjoyed this video, I bet you'd like this next one as well. Just click to watch. Attention Waltons shoppers, thank you for shopping with us.